you to... Okay, we are going to be recording this session, as you can notice. So welcome again, everyone who is joining me today. And in the meantime, while we are waiting for the coming participants, please share your name, your organization, where you are connecting from in the chat, so we get to know each other a bit. Also, please note that we have simultaneous interpretation for Spanish and French available. So for those who need to change the channel, go to the bottom of your screen, click on the little globe and select the channel, Spanish or French. I'm going to say the same in Spanish, just in case. Si prefieren escuchar la conversación en la traducción al español, busca abajo el botón Interpretaciones y el canal de español. Okay. Great. So we are going to wait for about 5 minutes for everyone to join. Welcome. We're very excited to have you here, and we will start shortly. Thank you for your first message, Maggie, through chat. Welcome. If you have any troubles with the interpretation, it's also in the chat explained. Thank you. Welcome for the newcomers. Hello, everyone. We are waiting a few minutes. Please feel free to write your name, as many of you already started. So we are grateful to welcome you. Write your name, organization, where you are connecting from in the chat. And we recommend you to keep your microphones turned on for the talk when you are not using them and not speaking. Thank you. We are going to be recording this, as mentioned. So it will be also available for participants who couldn't join after this session. So we wait maybe two more minutes for everyone to join us, and then we will start. We are also very grateful to Virginie and Eduardo, who are joining today as our interpreters into Spanish and French. Thank you. Okay. So a few more people are joining us. We are going to wait a little bit more, and then we will start. Thank you for your patience. Okay. I think we can slowly start. I think we are ready to start, if you agree. So, last 2 people joining. Okay. So hello, everyone, now officially, and welcome. For those who don't know me, my name is Luby Bogantes. I am the Capacity Strengthening Coordinator at the International Analog Forestry Network, based in Costa Rica. So I'm sharing morning sun with you all from my place. And it is a pleasure to kick off this year, 2024, with an online conversation between our director, Maite Smith, and the founder of Analog Forestry, Dr. Ranil Senanayake. Both of them constantly inspire me to work on analog forestry with new ideas and with fresh energy, rethinking global challenges that we face. And so I hope you will feel inspired and motivated by them today as well. I see many familiar faces of our partners, members of the network, trainers and friends. So thank you all for connecting. But I also see many new faces. So we warmly welcome you all to this talk. This is the first seed we are planting in 2024, and we are hoping to hold more conversations and reflecting spaces among us this year to spark new ideas and learnings in ecosystem restoration, which is a crucial topic nowadays. This webinar talk is organized also as a teaser for an upcoming English-speaking online and in-person analog forestry course starting mid-February. It will be our first analog forestry course specifically focused on the temperate mid-Atlantic region. And the in-person workshop will take place at the Bowie State University in Maryland in the United States. And the online course will include 8 virtual webinar and interactive sessions open widely geographically with international accredited trainers. So feel free to go to our website for more information. Also to register. The registrations are currently open. And this course is co-sponsored by the Chesapeake Education Arts Research Society, CHEERS organization, the STEAM Onward and Ujamaa Cooperative Farming Alliance, Bowie State University, Heathcote Community of School of Living, and the Mid-Atlantic Black Farmer Caucus and at Astra Farms. So we are very grateful to our partners on this new specific analog forestry course that's coming up. And without any further delay, I pass it on to Maite. And you are muted.
As always. First and foremost, many thanks, Luby, to you and the team that has made this course and this online talk take place. It's been a lot of work over the coming months, and we're very grateful to you and the partners for getting this together. This is a very exciting time for IFN. Not only are we starting 2024 with this course together with our partners in the US, we are incredibly excited to have Dr. Ranil Senanayake join us today, the founder of the Analog Forestry methodology, and talk to us about the urgency in supporting, actively contributing to, and advancing ecosystem restoration and regeneration. Across the globe, we are facing multiple interrelated environmental, political, social, and economic crises driven by a capitalist, patriarchal, and extractive economic model. Climate change further exacerbates these crises. We are witnessing not only declining biodiversity, extreme drought, flooding, erosion, and fires due to decades of deforestation, monocrops, and extractive industries, but also, not only is this having an immediate impact on our environment, we're also seeing the dire impacts, particularly on historically and socially excluded communities such as women, children, rural communities, indigenous communities, as well as people with disabilities. As a global community facing the climate and socio-ecological crises, we must urgently act to strengthen and expand restoration and regeneration practices. By connecting ancestral wisdom from rural, indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities with Western scientific knowledge, we can create space for diverse paradigms that redefine our relationship with the territories we inhabit and reactivate our planet's natural regeneration cycles. Analog forestry, together with many different ecosystem restoration and regeneration practices, is already playing an important role in these endeavors, with over 40 years of experience and results. The International Analog Forestry Network has a role in this. We promote analog forestry and support individuals, communities, and collectives across the globe interested in developing resilient and regenerative forest gardens with a high diversity of species, as well as including food, medicinal plants, and non-timber forest products. We are a global network of more than 20 partner organizations and 69 trainers across 20 countries, and most of our activity has happened in countries in the global south. But I don't want to be talking only about IFN. I think the most interesting part here today is to really listen to Ranil. And for those of you who don't know Dr. Senanayake, he founded the analog forestry methodology during and after his studies at UC Davis, with early implementation of this methodology in California. In the early 80s, he then set up the first analog forest at Belipola in Sri Lanka, which is currently still active today, as a model for what AF can achieve. So really thinking about many years later, we can see what this really does, no? He draws his inspiration for AF from biodiversity-rich home gardens of yore in Sri Lanka and continues to inspire people across the world about an integrated approach to wellness for people and our planet. Ranil is a biologist and has a doctorate in systems ecology. He's an honorary member of the IFN board and serves as a mentor and guide for many of us in the network. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Ranil, who has a presentation ready for us to talk to us about how analog forestry can contribute to climate resilience. So Ranil, many thanks, and I pass it on to you.
Thank you, Maiti. Do I have a screen share?
You do.
Perfect. Here we go. All right. Are we clear now? Thank you. Okay. So I want to talk to you today about analog forestry as a process for developing ecosystems that facilitate resilient and adaptive opportunities for biological diversity in this changing future. Now, to do that, let me start off by defining what we're talking about. What is biological diversity or biodiversity? It is the variability of living organisms and the ecological complexes of which they consist. This is the measure. Biological resources is the available resources of potential use or value to humanity. This is the value. So these are the two elements in biological diversity that we should be concerned about. Now, applying this for what we do in forestry and analog forestry, this is how the knowledge that we have today is applied currently to forestry. If you look at forestry, we start with the natural forest, and then we have plantation forestry, which is basically simple tree-dominated, or multi-age ecosystems. But importantly, physiognomic structure and biodiversity gain is not a critical goal. It could be both native and exotic species. So from this model comes the industrial forestry, agroforestry, all other applications of forestry that do not consider the physiognomic structure and biodiversity gain as a critical goal. Analog forestry, on the other hand, differs from these by looking at the original mature vegetation with crop species analogous structure and function. And the physiognomic structure and biodiversity again is a critical goal. This is what differentiates this from this and then the flow on. We also have indigenous forestry, which is modifying or adding to existing forest, and here is only native species. So this is the way we can differentiate our human approaches to forestry today. Now, in analog forestry, it's a silvicultural system that seeks to create a tree-dominated ecosystem analogous or similar to the original mature ecosystem in two things: architectural structure and ecological function. Now, when we start in structure and function, we must say, what is a forest? A forest is the mature stage of any tree-dominated ecosystems. And to be analogous to the forest, one must follow The serial succession is the thing as biodiversity builds up. This is called serial succession, the final stage being the mature forest. But remember that although tree species in a forest account for 80 to 90% of the biomass, trees account for only 1% of the biodiversity. Now, these are critical things to take into consideration when we are designing into the future. So, as a forest grows and matures, the number of microhabitats increase. The bark chemistry determines what kinds of epiphytes can grow on it. There are phyloteliomata, rot holes in the trees, the bark surfaces, dry cavities, the roots. All these provide microhabitat for a vast range of biodiversity. And this is why we have to look at maturity in a system that we are designing and building. Now, the analog forestry is guided by 12 principles, and I've listed them here. I'm not going to read them all here, but I'm going to demonstrate how they work by demonstrating 3 or 4 of these principles. Let's take principle 1. Begin. Observe and record. What do? We go to a forest or any tree-dominated area, and we write a physiognomic formula which to represent the architectural structure of the forest. So, how many canopies does this forest have? Does it have palms? Does it have vines? Does it have epiphytes? Looking at this figure, we get a formula like this, which says there are evergreen broadleaf trees at 5 canopy layers with vines, palms, and epiphytes and rhizomatous plants in the subcanopy. Now, this kind of shorthand is what we use to go and record what there is, and then to come back and to start looking at what we require. Now, what we require then is determined by our database. In our database, here are the notations of all the trees that we have. Once you get the formula and you want to say you got a V8 and you want to have other V8s, you go into the database and you look at your V8s, and then here are the other V8s. So will they fit into this area like alurites? Do you want it for the production of oil or biodiversity or whatever? The database allows you to do that in your design. Now, principle 2 also says understand and evaluate. So once we've understood the functions of the species that are going to be used in the design, then we must begin to propagate the species in our nurseries that are chosen to fit the design that we have made. So, and then we go to another principle, principle 5. Principle 5 says understand flow systems, because as water and nutrients flow across the land, the designer should attempt to slow down the speed of flow. So to do this on a landscape, we mark the streams out, we mark whether they are annual or whether they are perennial, and then we look at the slopes, they are going down on our maps, and then we try to make pools, channels, or other possibilities of design that will slow both nutrients and water going off your land. The next principle, or principle 5 again, understanding flow systems, you have to understand the pollution entering the farm and the erosion leaving the farm. These should be monitored and treated because you have neighbors around. So the erosion that comes onto the farm and the water that goes out of the farm. If you look at these pictures, this water is high nitrates coming in, big algal bloom. This is high amount of bacterial blooms in this. The pollution is heavy. So when these are noted, then we begin to address the treatment of these things in our design. Now, another principle says, principle 10 says, value biodiversity. So be aware of the potential to increase diversity as tree species mature. So here the trees are growing, but until they are fairly mature, all these epiphytes have no place to come onto it. So this is why we have to consider the the trees themselves as structures that are going to help with the increase of biodiversity. Again, this is non-target. We are not targeting them, but we are creating the conditions right for this biodiversity to come back. And in the future to come, biodiversity and holding biodiversity is going to be valuable, not only as a thing that keeps your ecosystem stable, but also as an international goal that's coming up with the CBD. Now, when you value biodiversity, community nurseries can be created, which can rescue, reproduce, and grow native species efficiently. Here in Ecuador, people have rescued these plants that had come down with the people who had felled the plants in the next area, and they've rescued them. They are now growing them, propagating them, and they go back into the design. Here's an example of analog forestry application in Sri Lanka, the Belipola Arboretum. Now here, this is the analog forest, this is the model. The analog design on the left here, 90% are exotic species. They mimic the natural forest on the right, which is 100% native species with added aesthetic consideration like color and similar volumes of photosynthetic biomass. In this case, about 70% of the vertebrate, the biodiversity that existed here have come back into this forest. Now, if you start looking at it and measuring it, we find that compared to a monoculture forest, an analog forest has a great amount of carbon content in the soil. So if you create a soil that is more analogous to the natural forest, yes, organic carbon is retained. Not only that, it's a living soil. So when you look at it in the bacterial colonies, again, an analog forest is a very high number, close to a natural forest, whereas a monoculture forest certainly does not contribute hardly at all. Now, here are some of the species that have returned to the analog forest, and these now serve as indicator species that indicate the maturity of the forest. So it's only when the forest is mature do these species come back. We consider them indicator species in that context. Also, the indicators of success also extend to the soil ecosystem below. Now, this is Sri Lanka. These are earth snakes. Earth snakes are like, they're the giants of the soil ecosystem. They're the whales of the soil ecosystem. To have earth snakes emerging and returning to your soil means your living soil has now really reached the state when it's mature, just like the forest above it. So these are the indicators, and for all of us, choosing indicator species for our own ecosystems is a very, very valuable exercise. Now, we spoke about the soil then, these earth snakes in the soil. What kind of ecosystem is the soil? The soil, again, we have to recognize, is the most specious ecosystem on Earth. A vast majority of soil organisms are microbes. Great many still have not been described. Consider, when you're looking at soil, 1 gram of good soil may contain 1 to 2 billion individual bacterial cells. Sharing this same gram, 100 to 200 million individual actinomycetes. In the same gram, fungi, a kilometer or more. Algal cells, nematodes, collemboles, microarthropods. So when we are dealing with building an ecosystem and restoring our ecosystem, just as much as the ecosystem above it, we have to pay attention to the ecosystem below it. And the ecosystem below it is integrally tied to the one above. And this is something all of us must understand when we are trying to do restoration on the land. Because the plant life, the life in the soil is totally dependent on input from the plants above. Most trees, tree roots provide up to 20 to 30% of the total root weight as exudates into the soil every year. In 5 years, the total weight of the soil, the roots have been released into the soil. Why? To maintain this complex soil ecosystem that I described before. And each species of tree provides different chemical compounds. And as a consequence, many species of trees have distinct species of associated soil organisms. So, building up a forest, building up trees, building up a plant dominated ecosystem must also be designed to build up the maximum amount of soil biodiversity you can in your system. Now, because of the effect of the tree roots on the soil, it is the tree roots that determine the depth that a living soil can extend to. If you look at this here, in the samplings, as we go down, initially at the top layer, we have this large amount of microorganisms. As we go down and as the organic matter is reduced, the microorganisms go down until eventually, when there is no roots to give any food into the soil, there's no more life in the soil. Here you see a field, a tea field, and you can see that it's only where the roots are that the soil has formed. If there's no roots below this, there's no organic matter, no soil that is formed. So for all of you doing restoration, use trees and you consider the roots. And quite often, it is the roots themselves that determine the rapidity with which your soil will return. Now, the other thing we're interested in is the retention of carbon in the soil. Now, if you look at this, if you do not disturb the soil, you can hold carbon in the soil for periods exceeding 3,000 years. But if we cut the soil, turn the soil, and disturb it regularly, then we only have short-term molecules in the soil and they disappear 10 to 30 years. So building a deep soil not only has a large amount of microorganisms and life in it, it also holds carbon for the longest time in any terrestrial ecosystem. Now, this is what has happened. Unfortunately, industrial agriculture has contributing hugely to the loss of living soil. It's also contributing to temperature rise through the emission of fossil carbon dioxide. This is how we do agriculture today. There's nothing, there's no biodiversity, and there is no soil. It's all fossil energy that drives the system. If you look at the energy input output for the US food system today, 12 calories of energy, usually fossil energy, is used to produce 1 calorie of food that can be consumed. And this is not a relationship that is sustainable, and that's why it has to be addressed. But what is happening today is that because of this activity, the environment is forced to absorb the untaxed externalities of fossil-dependent industrial revolutions. They are negative externalities, and which is the carbon dioxide they're putting out. What's happening is that the concentration of carbon dioxide is going up, and with it, global temperature. And this is what we have to face and we have to address today as agriculturalists. Because the rise in ambient temperature is alarming because chlorophyll has an optimum operating temperature. Chlorophyll is an enzyme. And as an enzyme, there's a rate of reaction which increases nicely till about 37 degrees. After about 38 degrees, there's a steady decline. Now, all our plants, all productivity depends on chlorophyll. If chlorophyll is denatured, then the productivity goes down. In crop plants, the crop starts going down, and finally the plant itself dies. The phenomenon is also tied to what are called these heat waves. If a heat wave comes into an area and goes rapidly, you may escape the damage. But if a heat wave is retained in an area for some time, the effect on plants is devastating. And if you look at this, the average length and the time of heat waves is going up. Both the intensity and the length it resides is going up. So this is the future that we have to face with. What can we do? Is there anything that can be done? Because the increasing temperature also affects soil organisms. Earthworms is a good indicator species, cannot sustain themselves as the soils also warm. And looking at heat stress can take the crop at any time. And at any, even at when it's ripening, when it's growing, it's vulnerable. With the heat stress, you lose all of your agriculture. Here is what's happened in the last couple of years, and this is around Sri Lanka and India. And if you look at us, this area is going to be very, very hard pressed to start producing food into the future if the pattern of heat rays and heat waves continue. We have to address it now. What can we do? One of the things that's possible is vegetational cooling, because transpiration in plants provides cooling in the ambient environment. One large tree, for instance, gives you about 1,200,000 British thermal units of cooling a day, which is about 10 room-sized air conditioners. Now, if you have a group of trees, you can drop the temperature, the ambient temperature inside your grove could be 2 to 3 degrees cooler by the proper placement of trees. Now, when you come to designing a landscape, then agricultural landscapes, placement of trees and the use of trees becomes a really, really important criterion to consider, because if we have designs like this, which is what we have been told is going to be the future of agriculture, there will not be any food in the future. Because if there is a rise in temperature and a heat wave moves through and stays here for a day or two, the crop's gone. Whereas if you have a different landscape, production landscape, surrounded by trees, where your production units are in between this kind, then you have the ambient cooling effect also of transpiration. And these are the design considerations we have to think about moving into the future. Now, the resiliency, where do we get designs? Look at traditional systems. There are many traditional systems that grow hedgerows, protective areas. We are now designing trees and biomass. The resiliency of traditional responses gives us ideas on how we can start building up designs into the future. So, when we are looking at resiliency and adaptive opportunities for biological diversity that analog forestry can provide, with the resilience opportunities, we have to create ecosystems with a high B2B ratio, biodiversity to biomass. We have to create ecosystems with high transpirative cooling output. You saw with the increase in heat, this has to be done. We have to create ecosystems with a multi-story canopy to facilitate air movement, which is something else that's going to be required in agro-ecosystems into the future. Now, what are the adaptive opportunities we have? And that is, we have to begin crop breeding programs to incorporate heat resistance. We have to have new cropping opportunities for changing ecosystems. We need effective predictive mapping systems to facilitate climate response planning and agricultural landscape designs that minimize ambient heating. These are some of the resiliency and adaptive opportunities. But now, all the restoration opportunities discussed above ceases with the advent of urbanization. Why? Because with urbanization, all the soil functions cease. Here, the soil operates, there's an interchange of atmospheric soils and gases, etc. When we urbanize, we have a pavement put on it and it's impervious for penetration of water. And why the penetration of water is important is that if it's pervious, well, 1 inch of rain will give you 750 gallons of runoff because the rest are soaked into the soil. If we have impervious surface, all the rainfall goes out as runoff. So design becomes important because urbanization is now creating an impact actually on ecosystem functioning. Soil organic matter is important because it holds water and it gives us available nutrients and it increases the possibility for sustainable agriculture. But if we seal this, then we are creating a system where it is impossible to reverse because erosion of soil is a temporal process. It runs away, we can build it up slowly, and we can bring it back. But once we seal it with the impervious surface, it's gone forever. Now, this is what happens as we urbanize, we start losing the capacity of our land to give us ecosystem services. It also opens the land for extreme events affecting humanity in a very negative manner. Now, the problem is this. If you look at this figure, only the apples that go into the city have any value, while the farm has all this green material, the trees, the productive units, the biodiversity, all of it. But there is no value given to this. Now we doing analog forestry get in there and we create a beautiful farm and there's biodiversity, there's trees, there's vines, there's epiphytes, but it's only the crop that leaves the farm that has any value. So we must now look at the farm and say, how can we increase the value of the farm itself? One way to increase the rural income and the value is through value addition by certification systems. So as IFOAM that does organic, FGP does that analog forestry, and there are many other labels that demonstrate good land use. Now, these give the farmer some input, some increase, but in the end, it is the maximum price that that product can get, and it doesn't go below a certain ceiling. So again, what can we do here? Well, one of the ways that we have been looking after is by placing value on the primary ecosystem services, which are oxygen production, solar energy sequestration, and cycling water into the global commons. If you look at this picture, in the current economy, only the fruit has value, and it has value only once it's plucked and sent to market. The rest is no value in the current economy. But if we can realize the value of the primary ecosystem services, it means these leaves also have value. But these leaves can have value as long as it is living and producing primary ecosystem services: oxygen, fixing carbon, cleaning water. Pluck that leaf and the activity ceases, and so does the value. So the new economy that we are suggesting will put on a market, will put a value on life and create a market for ecosystem services. And creating a market for ecosystem services is critical for farming communities and rural communities because in 2011, when evaluation was done, the economists found that the value of the ecosystem services is $125 trillion a year. Now, today is up to about $175 trillion a year. But there is no capitalization of these ecosystem services as yet. So what we have done and what I'd like to present to you as a possibility into the future with what we do is incorporate people into the process of being paid for the production of primary ecosystem services. Earth Restoration is a company that has been working at this. We've been working for 5 years. And if you work at this, you'll see that these 7 ladies, these were war widows, having 45 plants called units, they produced $38,000 worth of oxygen in 4 years into the global commons and $513 worth of clean water. Now, this is a value. This is a new economy we are looking at. So one way of capturing this value is with Earth Restoration Life Force units, which represent contracted primary ecosystem service production. And this value can be increased by adding a B to B ratio. There's no time for me to go into detail here. For interested people, please come to, restore.earth, and you will see the operations. But now, I'd like to leave you with this thought, and that is currently leaves, which is what we were interested in for creating primary ecosystem services. Leaves produce a surface area of about 4.3 times the total area of land on our planet. They are the life support system of this planet, and they're being lost at an exponential rate. And there's an urgent need to increase this ratio. But if you look at this figure here, you will see this is the land area of our planet. There's less than 12% of the surface area of our planet that has the potential for living soil to support the plants with their life-giving leaves. Consider that analog forestry provides the largest surface area of leaves in any given area due to the fact that we use all the growth forms which are included in the design. And this is why some of the non-target biodiversity, like the epiphytes, like some of the vines, are also extremely useful because it adds to the surface area of the leaves of a given farm. Now, it provides both for adaptation and for resiliency. And when we do analog forestry, it always maintains a high biodiversity to biomass ratio. So if we develop a system of land restoration using analog forestry principles to attend to that land, not only can we begin healing that land, we can begin creating a new economy that will change the relations between the rural and urban sectors, because today, all of the primary ecosystem services and secondary and tertiary ecosystem services are produced in the rural areas. But the people who use it and who need it are the people who live in the urban areas. So the relationship has to change. We have to start looking at the rural sector as the new area for development, and analog forestry provides us with a very efficient and useful tool by which to do it. And I wish you all very well. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranil. Such a great talk, and also just you've touched upon many topics that I think shows how this is all connected, right? So it's not just looking at this just at forests, but it's really about how this is a systemic view to ecosystems restoration, and how it really has a connection with many factors in our lives. I also wanted to share with the group that the idea is obviously give space to Ranil to share his perspectives, his experience, and his knowledge with working with Analog Forestry, but also involved in different projects like the one you mentioned at the end of the presentation. And if people want to know more about this, please contact Ranil directly. We're happy to provide that information to you. But we did want to create a space for a dialogue. I have a few questions that I wanted to share with you. And yes, definitely we can share the slides and the recording. We will make sure that that's all available to you all. But maybe to get the dialogue side started, I know people get a bit shy when it comes to these spaces. I did have a question because in your presentation, you have explained how analog forestry is a methodology that focuses on tree-dominated ecosystems. Is the analog forestry methodology adaptable to diverse ecosystems such as grassland, desert, tundra, aquatic ecosystems beyond its primary focus? And if so, can you explain how it can contribute to the restoration and regeneration of these ecosystems?
Sure. When we talk about analog forestry, we start with the forest, and it is to be analogous, similar to the forest. To do that, you have to understand the forest itself. You have to understand that ecosystem. Now, the same thinking, the same principles can be applied whether you're looking at the tundra, whether you're looking at a desert, whether you're looking at a marsh, as the final mature ecosystem. Because wherever you are, what guides you is your final mature ecosystem. So, like what's happening today, you wouldn't go to the Paramore, right, and say, oh, I want to do restoration or carbon sequestration and plant pinus, right? You wouldn't do that. You'd look to create something analogous, similar to the Paramore flora, that will be useful for humans. It could be blueberries, it could be other things that we're going to bring in there. So that is the principle. When you're starting with analog forestry merely is a tool to help you think that there is an ecosystem, that it has diverse elements in it, and we have to address those elements if we are to restore it to any degree of sustainability.
For sure, and I really agree with you on the point of it being a tool. I've spoken to a few people that have taken the analog forestry courses, or actually practitioners, and one of the main things that they say is that through analog forestry, they are really able, through the whole observation exercise, really able to understand what is this ecosystem, looking at the different layers, what's there. So really taking the time, which we never do in the world that we live in, is to take time and observe. So I really do find that the analog forestry methodology gives you that tool of observation. And it's really important to hear what you say, that this is not just tree-dominated ecosystems, but we can really look at diverse
the mature ecosystem of any given area.
Exactly. I already grabbed one of the questions shared in the chat, but I have two more questions to you, and then I'm going to pass it on to everyone else. But the other question that I have is, there's always a lot of interest in the distinction between this methodology and other agroforestry practices. Could you elaborate on the specific differences between analog forestry and other agroforestry methods? And then also, how does it align or differ from restorative practices such as syntropic farming or food forests, which we know are similar, but are sometimes a bit different? So it would be great to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, basically what it is and why it differs is, in analog forestry, you have to pay attention to your local ecosystem. You have to pay attention to so you can't sort of come and just say, hey, I'm going to plant a bunch of these things because it's going to give me a lot of biomass. No, you have to be very, very cognizant of the context that you're in and the history. That's one. Second is that in analog forestry, like I showed you in the figure, in analog forestry, the biodiversity is critical. And creating biodiversity means that understanding that the structures that you make are useful to you, but it's also useful to bring back so much of the biodiversity that once lived in the area. You have to make space. You may not eat them or you may not use them for anything, but it's the native biodiversity. And that's what you have replaced by coming there. And what analog forestry does, it gives you a chance to invite that back again. These are not goals that are found in these other systems. Most of the other systems are just for production, for human beings, and that's it, finished. No, here you have to consider, because unless your ecosystem is sustainable, well, you're not sustainable. And if you haven't designed for everything else that's living with you to come back and live with you, then you have lost the heart of what is restoration. So that is what makes it different.
Great, thank you. And then this links a little bit to my next question. Analog forestry does have a focus on a social aspect of this. We work with and along rural and local communities, also indigenous communities, and accompany them with analog forestry practices, and also integrating their knowledge and practices within this work. One of the reasons why is because they have, because of the shift, where you showed us the shift in the industrial agricultural industry, how many of these communities have come to depend on agricultural food production and sale for their livelihoods, right? And so recognizing that analog forestry is a methodology that looks for non-utility biodiversity gain, as you just mentioned, how can it support these communities that have to prioritize now food sovereignty, or want to prioritize food sovereignty and agroecological practices?
Well, because if you look at all the studies that have been done, there's a direct correlation between biodiversity and farm stability. So that is one, straight, obvious thing that we have to look at. And the other thing is that if you look at traditional communities and traditional peoples or small farmers, the new concern that's coming in the planet is going to be biodiversity. With the Convention on Biodiversity now unfolding and markets opening up in this area, this gives an opportunity to put your hand up and say, look, we are aware, we have been doing restoration and restorative methods in this manner, and then you become the people who basically lead the restoration action, because you nominate the indicator species, and it's not just measures anymore. It's nature telling everybody whether you're a success or whether you're a failure. And in all indigenous communities, in all traditional communities, indicator species are obvious. They know it. It's a part of their culture. It's a part of their knowledge. So we are now giving them back recognition for their knowledge. And that's how we have to move forward in this manner when we start doing restoration in this way.
Great. Thank you so much, Ranil. I'm really appreciative for all your answers. I really want to open it up to the group. We have people from across the globe, so it's really nice to have people connected. I saw there was a question from Pablo in Regenerativa. Pablo, I'm happy to, if you want to place your question directly, I can also read it out, but happy to hear your voice if you would like, if you're still there.
Yeah, I'm here, Maite. Thank you very much. That's quite an introduction. Ranil, thank you very much for the for everything that you showed us today. I'm very grateful for it. My question is very specific. It's pretty much aimed at a very recent experience here in Chile that I saw an edible forest which use eucalyptus, which in Chile is an exotic species, and it's got a very bad reputation because of its groundwater consumption. So my question is that for soil restoration purposes, which is an area that I'm also very interested in, if should we try to use taproot-based trees that those that have the deepest taproots, particularly, and how does that relate, or what are the experiences in the usage of that sort of trees for restoration and the groundwater levels?
Okay. Pablo, the thing with first thing is there is no such thing in this world as a bad tree. Every tree is worthwhile. Every tree has their functions. Now, having worked in Australia with the eucalypts, where the eucalypts grow, right, the eucalypts evolved basically to do a function that was critical for Australia because the groundwater in Australia is saline. So when it rains, if the groundwater comes up and touches the roots of the trees, they die. And this is what happened in all of Australian farmland. It was called dryland salinity. It happened because the farmers cut all the eucalyptus and made grasslands for the sheep and the cattle, right? But the eucalyptus were pumping the rainwater out of the ground. When that stopped, the salt came up and started poisoning the farm, right? So eucalyptus were evolved in that situation. So if we use them, we should use them for that kind of function. So if we want to have areas that are waterlogged, if we want to have areas that we need the water table lower or reduce, you use eucalyptus. Or if you have areas that are extremely dry, we need timber, we need biomass, yes, we can use eucalyptus. Not in a monoculture, because here too, we use eucalyptus in the home gardens in Sri Lanka as a timber tree. So there's one or two eucalyptus because they grow fast and it's a good timber tree. And in Sri Lanka, in 60% of all the saw logs that enter trade come from our home gardens without 1 penny of investment from the government. It's all done by people, right? So just a little investment and you can get all here is an example of saw logs from home gardens. And this will involve eucalyptus too. So it's the context you use it in. And if you use it in the right context, it's extremely useful. And remember, if you're talking eucalypts, there's over 200 species of eucalypts. We have seen only a few. Australia has a wealth. And we haven't even thought about using any of these yet. So when we are doing analog forestry, we can say, hey, this may be analogous to what we require here. So yeah, I think we should be open-minded and move in and see how we can use these things in the design to give us the goals that we are seeking for.
That's great. Thank you for your answer. Very
Sure.
much.
Great, thank you, Paulo. Thank you, Ranil. I see Liz, you also have a question. Liz is from Guatemala. Ranil, you speak perfect Spanish, so I'm going to read the question out loud, and then I'll try to translate it.
Sí.
Según comprendí, las tierras desérticas ya no se pueden rescatar. ¿Es posible que la forestería análoga ayude a recuperar la biodiversidad en estas tierras desérticas? So Liz is asking, from her understanding, in desert lands, you're not able to rescue them anymore. We're not able to restore them. Is it possible for analog forestry to maybe help in that restoration of these desert lands?
Okay, the concept is this. It depends whether the desertification has happened as a course of nature, or the desertification has happened as a result of human beings. If the desertification happened as a result of human beings, then we say, what was the ecosystem that was there before? Because we know that naturally that ecosystem can come back into that area. And we begin using the serial succession, planting first the forbs and the grasses and building the system up with those species that once existed there. If if there were no species like that and it was just the desert, then unless you do a lot of artificial action, you will not be able to restore anything. But if the desert was a natural desert again, and it was cactus, for instance, and sagebush, etc., and that has been cleared and there's only sand, again, we'd go to the mature system, which was cactus, sagebush, etc., and design our ecosystem around the mature ecosystem that one has recorded for that particular area. So the short answer is it depends whether the desert has been formed by the action of man or whether the desert is formed by some natural process. If it's a natural process and it's dry like the Sahara, etc., then you have to spend a lot of effort. But if it is a Sahel type situation, yeah, see what was there before, use something analogous to it, and you can go and make the difference.
Thank you, Ranil. Liz, I hope that was an answer. Igual quiero abrir el espacio por si quiere añadir algo a su pregunta. Y también, I also want to open the space for others to join in the conversation if you have a question. Also to folks from the US course. This might be a lot of information for you, but please feel free to ask questions. This is really an open space. You can raise your hand and join the conversation. People are shy today, Ranil.
Yeah,
right.
because for all of us, we have to now start facing climate change and we have to design for the future to come. We are suggesting that we think about adaptive, resilient ecosystem areas in all parts of the world where it's possible. We create ecosystem areas which are adaptive to the changes coming, that are resilient to the changes coming. And these areas, usually we use analog forestry or other similar approaches to create such areas, would be very important to face the future, because the gene stocks have to be carried out into the future. And if there are not ecosystems that hold them, we're going to lose them.
Right. Thank you, Ranil. Thank you. I think with that, we'll slowly start wrapping up. I once more want to thank you for your presentation, for your talk, and also just for being who you are and for bringing, Galo has his hand up. Excellent. Galo, please go ahead.
Hello, Ranil, and thank you so
Hi,
much
Galo.
for your talk. Thank you for the space. I have a question. I was investigating something about actually I have two questions that are like combined. Like the first question is like there is natural forests, or there are like human or anthropogenic forests, because that's a big discussion over there. And also, what about like recalcitrant seeds? We if we cannot save seeds, so we have to save the seeds by planting them. So that's very important for the ecosystem. So yeah, I just wanted to know what's your perspective about that. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Because analog forests can include a gene bank, which is a living gene bank. As you know, many tree species, their seeds don't stay alive for too long. It must be planted while it's pretty fresh. So an analog forest basically is the living gene bank for tree species. Because with tree species, many tree species, we can't freeze the seeds, we can't keep them cold, they lose vitality. So this is what will give us a chance to take them forward. So that is why it should be looked in that context. It is not only a farm, it is not only a production area, it's an area that produces a large amount of primary ecosystem services. And this is the new wealth, this is the new economy. And hopefully that will give us enough opportunity to have the tree species that are rare, endangered, disappearing within our farms as a part of our design. Then that is the only thing I think in the future that's going to hold these species. And there's something else. Gallo, today we have cleared probably 90% of the forests of this earth. People are living in the area that they have cleared. However much we may wish, they will never leave those areas, and those areas will never go back into being forest. Never. People will not go. What we can do is in the area where these people live, we can create ecosystems similar to the forest that was lost, and thereby bring stability back into those areas again. And the people who are living there should be the agents of change. And and it is us human beings then who made the destruction and who can also make the change to invite the forest back again. And that is hopefully what analog forest is a tool that will help us do.
Gallo, you said you had 2 questions.
Yeah, he answered me both. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Thank you, Ranil.
Bueno.
I see a hand raised by Marta, and I see a question in the chat. Maybe we'll go first with Marta, and then I will, now people have lost their shyness and they're throwing many questions. So Marta, maybe you go ahead, and then we can read the questions in the chat.
Muchas gracias, Maite, y muchas gracias, Ranil, por su presentación, la verdad, excelente. Y la pregunta es la siguiente: conozco muchas comunidades campesinas e indígenas acá en la Argentina que están reforestando con plantas nativas, eso es muy común, pero sin embargo no son reconocidas como una restauración del ecosistema, con la recuperación de tierras, con todo esto que nos estuvo explicando. Y la verdad es que necesitaríamos, las organizaciones que apoyamos estas comunidades, esas explicaciones, esa demostración, ese balance de la recuperación de los microorganismos que están en la tierra, del agua, de la colaboración al tema ambiental, a través de la reforestación con plantas nativas. Entonces, si podría solicitar que nos envíen un documento para que nosotros podamos demostrar que esto ocurre, porque en general no se lo ve así. No solo que ocurre porque se lo ve únicamente como una cuestión de sobrevivencia, de esto de la soberanía alimentaria, nada más, pero no se ven todos los otros beneficios que acaban acá de mostrarnos, y nosotros quisiéramos poder transmitirlo a quienes y buscar apoyo a este tipo de actividades. Eso era nada más, no era una pregunta, sino una solicitud. Muchas gracias.
Ranil, do you
Thank
want to
you,
answer?
Marta.
Do I want to answer?
Yeah. Thank you, Martha. And also, I should tell you that this kind of thinking is very useful. For instance, if you go up to Misiones province, you're from Argentina, that's where, we grow the mate. But if you see the mate been growing now, it's mostly like hedgerows, and all the diversity that was in the forest is lost. Now, if we have farms that include the mate and we have an analog forest design that brings back the biodiversity, then the tea that goes from there could have a higher value if it's certified. So there's immediately a gain you can make in those areas. So yeah, Martha, use this knowledge, and I'm sure you can help a lot of people back home. Thank you.
Thanks, Ranil. Yeah, and maybe I can complement from the IAFN. Not only does the methodology for analog forestry with the principles help you also monitor and this observation side, which is very simple, to start identifying, looking at biodiversity, looking at soil, looking at what is growing around you, and really kind of registering that. And within IAFN, we also have a monitoring framework that looks at ecological restoration, but we're also talking about well-being. We're also talking about food sovereignty. We're also talking about economic sustainability. So many, many indicators that can help local communities look at what they're doing with their projects and really start showing the value of this work and sharing it with others with clear indicators. So Marta, we will be happy to share this with you and be able to support you also in that work. I'm going to go.
Muchas gracias, muchas gracias.
I'm going to go to the two questions in the chat. So one is from Maggie. She's asking for more information on the Restoration Foundation. Ranil, maybe you can share a little bit more, or maybe it's maybe Maggie,
okay.
You can explain your question a little bit more.
Actually, Maggie, if you go to restore.earth, the web page is restore.earth. There, everything is very clearly explained. If you go to the web page, just click on the video, you'll see the explanation. And then if you need further explanation or if you want to participate in the process, we'll be happy to talk to you.
Great, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Yeah, look forward to meeting you again soon.
Maybe you will come for our course.
All right. Well,
To the
let me
US.
know.
That's right.
That would be one.
Maggie's been one of our spearheads with the course in the US. So
Excellent. Well, whatever I can do, I'll be glad to help.
I'm just going to read one more question here from Josefina. I understand that in AF, or analog forestry, the specific intention is important. But could there be a design that can balance specific intention with biodiversity and ecological restoration?
Yeah, sure. Because the designer, once you understand the structure of what you're going to be doing and the functions of what existed there before, then it's up to you as the designer to choose what species you're going to put in there. So if, for instance, the person you're designing for, he or she says, oh, I want to do ecotourism, then the species you would choose would be species that bring in the butterflies, species that bring in the birds, the endangered species, species that the ecotourists will photograph, and that is your crop. Another person might say, look, we are very poor, we just want food on our table, we want something to sell. Then the designer has to choose from the database the species that are going to fulfill that function. So you have the structure, you have the functions, and once you have, and you're putting in your design, it depends on the end goal of the designer or the end goals of the owner of the land, what they want out of the design, that is what you choose to put in on the land. So it's a flexible system, and the system just requires you to understand what the natural forest or the natural vegetation, the climax vegetation of your own area was. And once you understand that, then you can think about what species are you going to replace for what effect? For beauty, for biodiversity, for income. That is the designer's skill.
Yes, indeed. Analog forestry allows for a lot of creativity, which is also an important skill. So
Principle 12.
indeed. All right, I think we're going to slowly wrap up. I also know that we have amazing interpreters, Virginia and Eduardo, who are working on their own to support us in this endeavor. So we're going to slowly start wrapping up. I do want to read in Spanish one of the comments left by Japachumi that kind of sums up a little bit the message behind this talk. He says here, or they say here, creo que es una buena conclusión para esta charla sería implementar estos sistemas análogos que suplen la vida en toda su variedad de formas y reclamar la importancia y el valor de la vida de parte del mismo agricultor y del consumidor y público en general. So really I think about valuing those ecosystems around us being part of those ecosystems and the services that we're providing.
Bueno, sí.
Sí. Thank you, Ranil, so much. Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Virginie. And also thank you to all of you that participated today. It's really great to have you all here and that you've made time to be here with us. I want to let you know that as we're doing this course, we're going to be doing a series of talks. So this is not the only one. Next week, Tuesday, January 23rd, we're going to have a second online talk called What Can We Learn from Analog Forestry and Forest Garden Experiences Around the World, where we'll have people from Ecuador, Cameroon, and France to talk to us. So please follow us on our website or on our social media accounts, and there we'll be sharing the information about this online talk, which is happening next Tuesday. And so we hope to see you all there. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.